I'm speaking to you from Ireland, and actually from the west of Ireland, from the village of Newport, County Mayo, which is near Westport. We were, until 18 months ago, a community of about 4,000 people, but we've had the great pleasure of welcoming an additional 1,000 more, 1,200, of your countrymen, women and children in the past 18 months. They're now our neighbours, colleagues and friends, and it's a joy to have them become part of our small community here on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean, even at the same time as we understand that most of them just long to go home. Your country is in a situation of hideous oppression, and my heart goes out to you. I pray daily that the war will end soon and that healing, what can be had, can begin. Displacement is not a mere consequence of warfare, it's one of its techniques. The trauma wrought on the population is intended to erode its ability to resist oppression. Longing to go home is part of that trauma of deliberate displacement. Along with it goes another closely related trauma, not knowing. Not knowing whether a return home will be possible, maybe it will, maybe it won't. And furthermore, not knowing what will be found there, even if return is possible. These uncertainties are wrapped up in the very longing to go home, and they complicate it considerably. My own ancestors once longed to go home. In the distant past, they were kicked off their land by invading British, and for many centuries had to live either as tenants of the new rulers or else to leave and move to other countries if they could. In the more recent past, both my parents were displaced, made homeless when they were children. My father, after his home in Liverpool was obliterated by a bomb during the Second World War, and my mother when her parents fled destitution in rural Ireland for poverty in urban England. Actually, she was nearly an adult. I said she was a child. Anyway, a young person. I was born to these people in England and heard them talk constantly of moving home, and they never did. And occasionally we holidayed back in their home landscape like tourists. I see mine recently returning to live here in the region of their birth as an attempt to heal the intergenerational grief caused by the acute longing to go home that was the hallmark of their lives. Displacement is a technique of war, but also of colonization, including economic oppression and exploitation. And just as displacement is caused by many different factors, so too does it take many different forms. Forced mobility, like we had here in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, when Catholics were burnt out of their home by Protestants, is different to forced mobility as experienced by women trafficked here from Eastern Europe to become sex workers. War affects rural areas differently to urban ones. And people experiencing homelessness, which is still a phenomenon here, although it has economic causes, report many various experiences of it. And so I imagine your experiences in Ukraine have been different from one place to the next, from one family to the next. But everyone who has been displaced in all its different forms and shapes has in common the experience of losing their regular point of shelter and not knowing where their next one is coming from. This is why it's so important in international protection that those fleeing war are guaranteed shelter in their new country. Shelter is the single most important thing for life, for human life, after food and water. We all need a known, consistent, stable, you don't have to fight for it, you can pay for it, safe point of shelter every night. But as displaced people know very well, a shelter is not the same as a home. Shelter does not satisfy our longing for home. So when we long for home, what exactly are we longing for? And specifically for Christians, what does home mean? Or perhaps what should home mean? I live in Ireland. Centuries, as I've already told you, centuries of colonization have left a legacy in which the concept of home matters in particular ways to our understanding of a nation. For a start, the modern Irish nation is not just home to the Irish, but also, and problematically, not home to the British. Because of the history, but also because of not really digging into the history theologically. The idea of home is deeply woven into our modern psyche as a nationalist entity. Similarly, home ownership also matters in a special way here. After independence, there was a land commission. This ran from the 1940s to the 1970s. Property was taken off the former ruling class and distributed to so-called indigenous people, my own family included. Other post-colonial countries would long for such seeming reparative justice. But when it became a wealthy country, Ireland abandoned even its relatively small provision of social housing and has built hardly any in the past 25 years, despite repeated studies showing that this social housing is the only measure that can prevent homelessness. It's typical, if you live in Dublin, to earn about €6,000 a month, to pay half of it in taxes, leaving 3,000, and then to pay 2/3 of that, 2,000, on rent. 1,000 left, and that's if you can find anywhere to rent. The common political consensus on how to address this is for the renter to buy an expensive house through immense debt, and multiple schemes are in place between the government, private developers, and banks to get people onto the housing ladder, rather than to provide social housing at affordable rents. Such a political doctrine is defended by appeal to post-colonial self-realization, but it means that autonomous home ownership has become insidiously linked with citizenship. This becomes all the more problematic when you think of the millions of climate refugees on the near horizon and no plans here to incorporate any of them into our nation. Neoliberalism connects synapses at an embodied level between these themes of the nation as home, the despised other, Britain, as not part of this home, legitimation as citizens accomplished through home ownership, and the refusal of migrants. It does this through myriad seemingly small cultural phenomena, including millions of websites sending you to their homepages, the spinning of austerity measures as anti-migration politics, and all those television programs that we have here. I don't know if you have them in Ukraine, but every night you can watch program after program on finding, buying, decorating, selling, improving your home. And you have to remember, you can't do any of that, can't knock down a wall in a rented property. It's for owners. Home has thus come to function in our culture as my domain to which I'm entitled, and the occupation of which signals my legitimacy and belonging. What Benedict Anderson once said of the nation can also be said of the home. It's an imagined political community, and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. Human beings are creatures. The earth is their home, but as mentioned above, they do need a specific resting place on the earth, a place to sleep which is safe and consistent, but more than that, it must also afford access to sustenance, to emotional belonging, to spiritual belonging. Now, that sort of a place, that sort of an understanding of home has not been valued in the projects of modernity. You can't make money off it. And as Jan Wilhelm Duivendijk, a Dutch scholar, has argued, it's nostalgia, deep intergenerational nostalgia for that sort of home that has led to what he calls the framing of the nation itself as home. If people's true needs for belonging and sustenance were met, he argues, the politics of home would not play out as the European far right or US Christian nationalism like we've seen grow massively in the Trump era, nor as Ruski Mir. One of modernity's key features is its framing of the nation at home, while simultaneously corroding other possible conceptual and pragmatic forms of home. And when theology considers displacement, it usually examines theological reflections from people experiencing temporary homelessness, or it asks what the church ought to do in response to the suffering caused by homelessness. But I propose that theology also needs to better understand that it's operating already off a tacit theology of home, and we need to review it. And so in the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to argue that certain imaginings of home have made Christians vulnerable to the twin forces of nationalism and neoliberalism. You might say capitalism. The twin forces of nationalism and neoliberalism that cause homelessness. But that other Christian ideas might yet be reclaimed to help resist these forces. Christian theology, at least in the West, since the early modern period, has had a premise that we humans came from God and to God we will return. Jesus, it's claimed, came to make this very thing possible. A famous hymn based on Psalm 90 sings, "O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, be thou our God while troubles last, and our eternal home." According to this sort of thinking, whatever the world throws at humans during their short time on earth, their ultimate point of refuge, security, and belonging, their home, is in God. The idea that a Christian's original home was God, and especially that their future home will be also, has helped many people to tolerate suffering in this life, because the present is as nothing compared to an eternal home in God. But this idea of home as eventual sanctuary after pain has also made Christians vulnerable to a series of destructive projects. Instead of indicating security of belonging with our Creator and understanding the present moment as part of God's eternal home, it has indicated a displacement from God, a longing to go home to God, inducing a trauma, the trauma of separation, and generating attempts to compensate for this insecurity. How? At least 6 ways. First, human time on earth came to be seen as exile, giving rise to the belief that one can accumulate credit in this life through suffering or sacrifice, to secure one's place in the next life. Historically, in the West, the church became the mediator of these transactions by selling indulgences or making salvation conditional on the sacraments. This created a deadly linkage between individual sovereignty and institutional capital. Belonging to a life in God became accumulation of capital. Second, reform of the church to faith not works ended clerical mediation of salvation and buying one's way into heaven, and brought Christians back to scripture. But in some cases, it also gave rise to the belief that my eternal home with God is a matter for me primarily as an individual. God's eternal home became subject to doctrines of predestination, and human community became ordered by emphasis on autonomy and individualism rather than collective belonging. And with this, belonging became respectability signalling, like home ownership is in Ireland today. Third, as Christendom gave way to nation states, colonization, and scientific discovery, so the idea calcified that eternal home in God was something only for Christians. A dichotomy between Christian and not Christian became an organizing global principle, the West and the rest. With it, the roots of white supremacy. Also, the roots of modern homelessness, because there's a pervasive foundational thought form in Western society that sees some as entitled, righteous, and the rest as vagrants, sponges, dropouts, illegals, and losers, as Nisha McSweeney has recently summarized it. These are people experiencing homelessness. This is how people experiencing homelessness have been called in my lifetime. Vagrants, sponges, dropouts, illegal, and losers. Belonging then became entitlement, but for the superior, the people who were none of those things, the people who didn't think they could be any of those things. Fourth, with industrialization and colonization came the loss of the significance of land, of place to life. This separation matters in itself, but also, Willie James Jennings argues, because it so interrupts the synapses of belonging that our very ability to relate is lost. Belonging became defensive, producing nationalized difference, which manifests as shape-shifting violence against the other, you are experiencing in hideous form, like people before us experienced in slavery, and in our society, sectarianism, and in common to all of us, eco-catastrophe, and more recently, what Achille Mbembe has called the normative politics of enmity within democracies. So the separation from land didn't just move people, it moved the way in which we learn to relate, because we relate to a place. And then that opens up this radical othering that then gets more and more polarized. And we see the other, we see massive difference and non-relatability as fifth. An implied separation from home and God has combined with an overemphasis on God as a father figure. God is imagined as the head of the household. When laminated with nationalism's structural thought form of militant masculinity, this produces Trump or Viktor Orban or the Russian Tsars and Putin modeling himself upon them. The father of the nation is presumed to have supreme authority. If God is a white man who's in control of everything, then white patriarchal authority's job is to restore order. There's a confusion between human and divine. It's an imperial fantasy, but it has been revived to aid a corporate consumer economy because it quells other voices. It quells the voices of those who are being oppressed, whether that's in war or those fighting for civil rights or immigrants' rights or women's rights. Belonging became patriarchy. Sixth, the longing for a real home that leads to the framing of the nation as home is not merely political, it's also ritual. National anthems and nationalist hymns have been sung in worship. National colours have adorned decorations in churches. Worship spaces have seen national flags set up within them, sometimes beside the Bible or altar or tabernacle. In Ireland, this has also meant one sort of flag in one sort of church and another sort of flag in another sort of church. Sacramental theology and political theology ought to talk to one another in this moment, wherein deep longing to go home in God turns into not a pacifist or a social justice seeking Christ, but Christ as the author and the protector of the nation. And so the idea that from God we came and to God we will return produced a gap of the now, a time displaced from God. And our home became imagined as a salvific capital investment, respectability signalling, an entitlement for the superior, a bulwark against the other who is inferior, removed from the natural world, ruled by a father figure, and divinely ordering of nationalist affinities. But when Psalm 90 spoke of God as eternal, or Genesis 3:19 said, "You are dust, and to dust you will return," and 2 Corinthians 5:1 says, "For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with human hands, eternal in the heavens." These were meant to affirm human belonging in God's creation, in God's eternal home, not to create a sense of interruption or even abandonment, the insecurity of which is responsible for the states of defensiveness and neediness that could garner a theological gloss like I've just described. In these 6 descriptions of home just given, instead of being assured of belonging in eternal love now, humans are left longing to go home. They are left longing for a lost, vital attachment. No wonder they're vulnerable to the twin forces of consumerism and nationalism. However, there are biblical imaginings of home that don't chime with nationalism, and I'm going to briefly outline 3 of them. First, a life of discipleship as home. Jesus commanded people to leave their homes and families and follow him. Mark 10:29. There is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for my sake and for the sake of the good news who will not receive 100-fold. This means following a way of life that eschews cultural expectations for home and family. Again, Luke 9:58. Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And the implication being, you should do likewise. The life that Jesus led indicates that he doesn't actually mean live on the road with no points of sustenance or connection, because he himself returns over and again to friends' houses in Bethany, Peter's mother-in-law's, Lazarus's house. What he means is, don't use limited boundaries of belonging, like the nuclear family or the nation, as tokens of divine reward and security. Humans need homes. As research has demonstrated, human flourishing is radically inhibited if even a short period of homelessness is experienced in a life. So what ought home consist of for a Christian? When Jesus said, "Follow me," he wasn't saying, abandon all your housing. He was saying, don't let these attachments prevent you from living the gospel. These limited structures of association, alignment, and alliance are what enable the occupying imperial force to colonize minds as well as material and economic resources, making impossible God's purpose for you, individually and collectively. As in first century Palestine, so now, nationalism has become just another colonizing force. The emancipative force and telos of Christian discipleship is one way of challenging it. But alone, it's not strong enough. And so to a second biblical theme. God desires to make God's home with you. John 14:23. Those who love me will keep my word, and my Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them. This has often been interpreted in a spiritual sense. The Father and or the Son will come and make their home in your hearts. But what would it be like to have God come and actually make God's home with those who love Christ? In Ireland, this idea echoes the strong folk practice of placing a candle in the window of the house on Christmas Eve to indicate a welcome for the Christ child who, it is thought, wanders the world on that night looking for a home. But adding 80,000 Ukrainians within 1 year, we found the reality is educative. God's arrival is disruptive. Ukrainians now make up over 1.5% of the overall population of Ireland, but in towns like mine, they constitute a fifth. And all of a sudden, alongside wide-scale acceptance, there are occasional demands that people coming from Ukraine should be vetted to make sure that they are who they say they are, meaning not Russians or criminals. Articles have been written on how Ukrainians are ethnically akin to the Irish, in contrast to the Russians, who supposedly aren't. We've even had demonstrations, which, for all that they look like the work of the far right, and God forbid that they would become so, they started with a serious concern, because it's very hard to be welcoming to the Christ child who wanders the world looking for a home, when those who live here have not themselves been given housing, and the newcomers are. And so I think it might be helpful to consider those biblical references to home that arise not only in direct reference to God's desire to make God's home with us, as if he could just turn up, but also in the Gospel's teaching about the dynamics of what happens when someone's arriving and being given what the locals have been denied. For example, Luke 11:15-32, the famous story. A faithful son is hurt and angry that his father would throw a banquet for the squandering son who left, because he's been here all this time and a banquet has never been thrown for him. And what does the father in this story tell him? What if God in this story is not the father, as often assumed, but the prodigal? After all, he's the one who died and came back to life. And what if the Christian's role is to be the father, oriented to going out to meet those who actually show up, like God, as the wastrel child? The father said, We had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found. I suggest this might alter the prevailing theology of home. To claim that life itself is to be celebrated is to insist that the bonds between the living, qua life as living entities, far outweigh the boundaries that arise between us. Dispositions of witness, of co-identifying, are cultivated by remembering that humans are most bonded not by family ties, which can break, but by life itself, by being alive. Thus, boundaries must extend to include and celebrate all who are alive, rejoicing in life's persistence, claiming what comes before you as being found, and celebrating that it is found when so much is being lost. One of the things I loved about living in Coventry, England, in their Emmaus community for people experiencing homelessness, I was their first director before academia lured me. One of the things I really loved was that everyone who lived there was called a companion, whatever their station in life. If Christ is imagined as turning up at one's door as another, or as the least of these, only in need of feeding, clothing, being cared for, there's a very different sensibility at play than if Christ is imagined turning up as a companion. The home becomes an economy of mutual accompaniment. You can see how this is not in the script to the interpreters, just a flag. You can see how this idea of mutual accompaniment, the quality of companionship, then reinforces and expands what it means to have a life of discipleship. Back to the script. God making God's home in material as well as cardiac spaces in our lives demands not help, but cohabitation. How? When Christ arrives, what is demanded is to celebrate life itself. This is not a small thing. You need a different disposition in order to be able to receive people who were previously other to you. And this constitutes home. It cultivates a disposition of home as witness, as co-identifying, even amid difference and disappointment. The one who arrives, the displaced person, is no longer the other, because God cannot be wholly other. God is the creator of the creation upon which all creatures depend for life, and God is incarnate within this creation and committed to relationship with it without end. Fundamentally then, this theology of home is a covenantal one, in contrast to the ontological one so prone to nationalism. Instead of from God you came and to God you will return, God instead wants to make God's home here with creatures in their creatureliness. This reframes otherness by inhibiting its manufacture in the first place. Finally, sacramentality as home. Sacramentality has a damaged reputation, as mentioned earlier, having been misconceived at times to instrumentalize God's grace and to endorse nationalism. But emerging from Louis-Marie Chauvet's recent revival of the idea, I think there's the possibility of a further aid to reimagining what home might be to a Christian. Chauvet, as you might know, uses Heidegger to rearticulate the sacraments in terms of symbolic mediation instead of cause and effect. Rather than looking to the mediatory power of a priest or a metaphysical magic, he looks to the ways that language and symbols, through gestures and rites, mediate God's presence and work in the world. only through the body, individual and collective, can scripture and ethics reframe sacramentality as the marks proper to Christian identity. Chauvet thus shifts theology's focus from the sacraments to the sacramental, opening up what he calls a sacramental interpretation of what it means to lead a Christian life, a life of discipleship. Adopting a sacramental view of life entière involves seeking to recognize God's ongoing presence in the absences presented by exclusion, erasure, ecological collapse, and all else of life that is, to echo the prodigal son's father, lost and not yet found. For this to work, sacramentality can't be thought of as the sole preserve of ecclesial authorities, but rather as God's ongoing revelation via the whole of the created order, claiming the sacramentality of the whole of the created order. This reimagines home in at least 4 ways. It is a salve to the anxiety of exile. God did not abandon humans in this place, earth. They are part of the entirety of God's created order, and due to the cosmic reach of Christ's incarnation, given the materiality of this order as symbols of God's love, so as to be at home in this world. So there's no gap, there's no separation anxiety anymore. Secondly, this idea of home refuses the idea that one's individual human body is one's home without rejecting the significance of the body. It is through one's body that one lives in the world, but Christians are part of a sacramental body that can only be understood like Christ's, on which it is modelled, as threefold: social, ancestral, and cosmic. Third, it acknowledges worship, broadly understood, as a unique aid in creating the sort of home into which God can come and make God's home. 10 years ago, I wrote a piece that argued that it would be productive to think of worship as home, but I've come to see that claim as too idealistic. I do, however, still view Christian ritual as a privileged place for theology because uniquely it directs people to the body via the Logos in their midst. So participation in worship over time shows a way home. We can feel at home in worship, and in doing so, recognize what it is to be at home in the cosmos, not the nation. Christian nationalism requires a racialized religiosity to survive. Look at sectarianism in my own country, or the fantasy of a Protestant-only governance in Christian nationalism in America, or, of course, Ruski Mir as Russian Orthodoxy. Not Orthodoxy, not Christianity, but Russian Orthodoxy. Sacramentality, then, must be very carefully understood. Sacramental participation may occur within a specific faith group, but the home it indicates, the home to which it shows a way, is within the entirety of the created order, the cosmic Christ. The denomination in which worship occurs must not be confused, as it so often has been, with divine belonging, nor with national legitimation. My fourth and final suggestion, then, is to see the sacramental as the oikos, the Greek word for home. And that reconnects us with the oikumene, the whole of the inhabited earth. And to let that challenge the ways that inter and extra faith divisions can mimic nationalistic ones. Ecumenism is the context of sacramentality, this sort of sacramentality. And if we embrace it, it can model anti-nationalism for us. In very brief conclusion then, it might be fruitful to consider the use of the word home as a verb as well as a noun. Because in all that I have suggested, there's posited a dynamism in the imagining of home in place of the ossification that characterizes standard conceptual framings of home. First, home is not something for the Christian to make, buy, or align to, as with a nation, because God desires to make God's home with us. So openness to that, which includes to the disruption it causes and the hard work it involves, that is the disposition to cultivate. Second, the myth that our home is a place in the future needs debunking. Following the Bible, we can see that our time on earth is part of that eternal home with God. And for as long as we're here, the life of discipleship to which Christ calls us is itself home. And lastly, the sacramental, not the sacraments, can show us in an ongoing way, a rehearsal, if you like, a recalibration, attunement along the way. Again, a dynamic understanding of learning to be at home. The sacramental can show us what it is to be at home in this world. These imaginings of home as a verb, as well as a noun, allow us to hear differently the opening lines of the book of Revelation. See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. The longing to go home will remain. Such is the effect of perceiving ourselves as separated from what we love. But we can better articulate what sort of a home we long for when nationalist and consumerist assumptions about belonging are challenged and not tied to any sort of life in God. When home is no longer a form of property or political economic relation. In the theology of home I've been suggesting this evening, home is divine belonging. It is already secured, and life itself is what connects creatures, like a verb, to their home in God, the earth, and one another, making redundant the nostalgia that prevents one from seeing God in all, and creating a new aim for our status in life as neither owner or stranger, but a companion among companions. First of all, I think it's salient to just own my context here in Ireland, where we have had to, what was it? Some people say 600, some people say 900 years of colonization by the British, a very long struggle. And it required a very strong sense of national identity and the sacrifices that people made to over many years to construct that identity and to organize militarily, and over so long are something that I would not be here without. The problem comes when that, let's call it essential, survival-oriented, your autonomy, as individuals and as groups, relies upon there being a organizing structure to your country that you have the right to control as a population. The problem comes when that becomes confused with or substitutes for the totality of your understanding of the world. So yes, we would not have the very fortunate country that we have had since we left the Commonwealth in 1949, and the opportunity that I personally have had without a strong nationalist movement, of which my family was very much a part. And but then in my lifetime, we've also had the IRA. We've also had mass consumerism substituting for national identity, becoming normative, and many other related problems. So what's the difference? I'm speaking about what I know, which is my context, and I will get back to Ukraine in a minute, which I don't know about. So my remarks there would be speculative. That's why I'm starting with what I know. So what makes the difference between being a nationalist and being a terrorist? And this is an acute question for me, because of course, growing up displaced as Irish in England in the 1970s and 80s, with a recognizably Irish, pro-Irish family, whenever bombs went off or terrorist activities happened, we would be bullied mercilessly in school. And trying to name the distinction between where nationalism is very important to family identity and country self-realization, and where whole groups take that to particular extremes, has been a lifelong question for me. And I think what I'm trying to do in this paper is maybe it's overly simplistic, is to say, have a nation, be part of a nation, stand up for people within your nation, stand up for yourself. You have to, people, whether society is organized by nations or tribes, you can't just go into another territory and take it. That has to be resisted. And you have to create the morale necessary to resist that. And the flags, I imagine, that you mentioned, are part of that morale. And I imagine there's a huge amount of political, artistic, cultural, musical, poster art, all sorts of things are needed to generate the national coming together that's needed, the energy that's needed to resist that aggression. But if we say that what we are fighting for is synonymous with home, then we're going to end up with problems when the war is over. We're going to end up with problems now, because home cannot create, you can defend yourself, but creating others or seeing your own ways as normative for anyone other than yourselves, or limiting, as the Russian Orthodox Church is doing, in my view, limiting its view of what's right for the world to what Russian Orthodoxy sees as right for itself. This is all the downside of nationalism. So the word nationalism needs qualifying. I, in my talk, was talking about that aggressive form, where it becomes a mistaken view of the entire world and not as an organizing principle for your own society and culture. That's why in the things I said later, considering ourselves as part of a cosmos, just being forced out of our limited associations, is important. It's not important in a struggle to prevent yourself being overrun by an oppressor. That's a different sort of nationalism. That's saying we're organized according to a nation and we have been invaded. So as a nation, we're going to defend ourselves. It's the theological question of the difference between that and saying, this is who we believe God to be. We believe that the way to God is through our nation. Our nation then becomes our way of telling the world how they ought to behave. And guess what? We're doing it because we think that's what God wants. Home is an organizing principle in our life. The nation is an organizing principle in our life. What I was criticizing when I spoke about nationalism was what happens when the nation isn't an organizing principle in our lives because it is our social and political context, but when people co-opt it as God's way of ordering the world through them and of perceiving others. Because much as I support the struggle in Ukraine, I don't think that Ukraine's identity is being championed, bolstered in it. There should be different words for it, because if you look at what is going on in Russia, where it's got this idea of this is a divinely supported plan for the world. Ukraine's first in the firing line, and has been for, as you say, what while the more normative it becomes, that people just get on board of a completely distorted view of how God relates to the organizing principles of our world, and what we claim of God and what we claim as divine or sacred in the organizing principles of our world. I suppose what I'm hoping for is that by trying to find a Christian theology of home, we will be better equipped to cope. I don't have a good answer to this question, this very good question today, but I have a hunch that if we have shared the idea that we are the commercialized, the consumerist idea of home, and a tightly religious national idea of home, then we will be in a better position. But I can't yet predict this is a conversation that needs to happen, and I suppose all I can hope to do is, in a very small way, offer these few alternative ideas about home from the Christian tradition, like discipleship, which involves moving, which is different to displacement, but maybe we can dig into what moving in a situation of mass movement feels like, and the other ideas that I gave, just to begin to mature, to stew, to generate alternative ideas of home so that we can cope with a radically changing world.